We'll now be turning it over to Alex Gladstein, who's the Chief Strategy Officer at the Human Rights Foundation, to address why financial privacy matters for human rights. Over to you, Alex. Oh, Alex.
Terrific. Thanks everybody for having me. I'm not wearing a suit, so I'll be kind of representing the human rights activists and the common person, I suppose, today. But I think it's wonderful that the commissioner came and talked to us about this topic. It's, I think, very important to have a conversation and engagement with the government here in the United States on this topic. I think we're one of the few countries in the world where we could actually conceivably have victories in terms of lobbying for human rights and privacy. My work at the Human Rights Foundation focuses on the people who live under dictatorships and authoritarian regimes around the world. And for more than 4 billion people, they have no hope of that. They can't write a newspaper article expressing their views or protest in the street without fear, or create an NGO to support financial privacy or to prevent overregulation. They would get thrown in jail or worse immediately. So I think we have to have a global understanding of kind of why financial privacy matters, and you'll quickly see that it's most urgent for the folks who don't have the luxury, I would say, of being able to get on a call and discuss financial privacy with one of the people who runs the government. That is just not the case for someone who lives in Russia or China or Saudi Arabia or so many other countries. So really great the commissioner came on, but we're going to take this in a slightly different direction. I have some slides, and then I have a couple kind of topics I'll run through with you that some of the Fidelity folks suggested. So just bear with me one moment. So here we go. So, you know, I think this all starts in the imagination of actually fiction writers. There was always this idea that, you know, there could be this utopian society for governments, for leaders, where they could control and monitor and know everything about their people. And obviously this animated what George Orwell, you know, warned us about in 1984. And that to me is like the civilizational struggle right now is can we preserve privacy and can we preserve financial privacy? We have worked our way into, as the host said at the beginning, both in open societies and in closed ones, the scenario where we're just giving up all this information about ourselves every day. And I think that if we want to protect democracy, we're going to have to protect financial privacy. That's kind of my thesis for today. In the world's largest country, in China, as you heard, there's hundreds of millions of cameras and a very intricate, basically, data vacuuming and social engineering project happening right now through tools like WeChat. And I think what people probably intuit in some way, but may not really think about too hard, is that when you have all these convenient tools, you know, and you're getting more comfortable and convenient with your life, and you're swiping instead of typing and things like that, what you're really doing usually is trading off your privacy and freedom for convenience, and you're just building this really big brother situation on top of our daily lives, right? This micro surveillance. And this has gotten to the point in China where people, as this one millennial has said, you know, they don't know whether they're building a futuristic society or a cage for themselves. I think it's a little bit of both. I think, you know, some humans will have this cage future and others won't. And the difference in many ways will be financial privacy. As you know, you heard also, you know, cash is disappearing. I think sometimes its demise is overstated a bit, but I mean, these are numbers from 2018 from some major democracies, and you can just see that the percentage of transactions done with cash are certainly in the decline. I mean, it's less than half in the United Kingdom, less than a third in the United States, less than a quarter in Sweden, and only a small percentage of transactions are still done with paper money in Korea. Obviously, as we all know, there's a coin shortage in the United States. There was a war on cash recently in China, you know, that went with a narrative of maybe money could be dirty, that they were waging as the coronavirus spread. And if you've traveled, many of you are very, you know, well-traveled people. You've been to places like Stockholm or Beijing or Caracas, where for different reasons, you know, there is no widespread use of paper money. Everything's done with a swipe, right? So we have to think about what the implications are of that kind of society where all the money is digitally centralized, right? We have we have to think about what happens when we lose, again, the privacy and freedom that paper money affords us. And we have to think about the new powers that corporations and states gain over us, because what you buy actually says more about you than your words. If I want to spy on you, I want to see your credit card transaction, for example, even more than I want to see your text messages. It actually tells me what you're doing. And when you think about the technology of money, when we used to use paper or metal money and we went and bought something, we revealed very little about ourselves. Like, you go into a hardware store and you buy a hammer or a light bulb, and you pay with a $20 bill, and the merchant doesn't know anything about you. They don't know your address or your name or anything. There's no ID check, and it's a bearer instrument, and you're gone, right? So there wasn't really an opportunity for that big brother to grow. But now, when you're using your credit card or your phone, you're swiping, and then you're just giving up all this information about yourself in this growing stack, and these interconnected stacks that feed into all these different data markets. And that has some serious problems, problems that are posed for our human rights, especially for those of us who live under authoritarianism, right? Maybe you're not that worried if you live in Portland or if you live in New York City. But if you live in Moscow or if you live in Beijing, it's a real issue. So, the question is, how do we sort of take this from here? I mean, we've got this evolution of money where we've had bearer instruments of different kinds and different levels of scarcities that are starting to give way to digital instruments, right? Now it's not even just credit cards we're talking about. Most of us use our phone. We're beeping, it's more sanitary, right? And then soon enough, we're going to be using wearables, and then one day probably chips under our skin, right? That's kind of the trajectory of how we both communicate and also transact. And the interesting thing is, in 2008 and 9, some group of people gave us another way out. They gave us a way to do digital transactions in a cash-like manner. And that's why Bitcoin is so important, is because there's nobody in the middle. And that's just what I'll just kind of focus on for a second. The reason why Bitcoin matters for privacy is that there's no third party in the middle. Unlike any other way you could do a digital transaction today, where there's somebody in the middle, with Bitcoin, there's nobody in the middle. And it's really as simple as that. If you're using Visa, if you're using MasterCard, if you're using a bank, if you're using a social media company, all these people run through the commercial banking system that are all, have to abide by the rules and regulations of the country that they operate in, right? So governments have this basically agreement that, hey, you guys can do this as long as you give information about your customers to us so that we can prosecute terrorists and money launderers and whatever. And obviously some of that is legitimate activity, but a lot of it's not, especially in dictatorships. So what you have here is, like every other legal digital way of sending money, has this either mandated or why not people in the middle, different kinds of intermediaries. In Bitcoin, there truly is no one sitting in the middle. So when I send a transaction to someone else, it cannot be stopped, but it also can be very difficult for other people to identify what's happening. And there's amazing technology happening in Bitcoin right now to help obfuscate transactions between two parties. And I think this is such a big innovation. I think it's almost as big as what we did as humans with government when we democratized and decentralized government through elections and through separation of powers, or when we democratized and decentralized information through first the printing press and then later other innovations, ending now with the open internet. I think Bitcoin is on that par. And this is why I like to think of the three futures of money. We're going to have state money, of course. We're going to have central bank digital currencies. We can get into that. We're going to have corporate money. Libra was just sort of the first shot. We're going to have all kinds of corporate money, but then we're going to have the people's money, and that's very important. Nassim Nicholas Taleb says that Bitcoin's mere existence gives us, the crowd, an insurance policy against an Orwellian future. I want to unpack that for a second, because I think it was on full display last summer in Hong Kong when protesters, mainly students who never used a ticketing machine like this normally, I mean, they would use their card, their smart card, their Octopus card. They realized that if they used their Octopus card, it could be connected with their identity and they could get in trouble. They could get expelled or fired from their job or whatever. So people would line up in these huge queues to purchase sort of these single MetroCard type tickets with cash. And, it got me thinking about how important it is in an urban environment, like most people in the world live in an urban environment, how important financial privacy is actually for protesting and for keeping governments honest. Like we're not going to want the government to know where we're going or if we're participating in a protest. And we have a couple different technologies for that. As you can see here, this is pre-pandemic, but a lot of them are wearing masks. So we have the mask, and we also have hopefully private digital money, of which I think Bitcoin is the most easily the one that I think has the most staying power and the biggest security model. And if Bitcoin fails, I really believe this WeChat model that I discussed at the beginning will win. And that's why I think this is so existential, so civilizational. But I'm not pessimistic. I'm optimistic because Bitcoin is doing quite well. It's growing. And if it does indeed survive and thrive the way I think it could, we'll have money that can't be censored, that can't be devalued, that can't be monopolized, that can't be easily mass surveilled, that can't be stopped by borders, and that can be accessed by anyone. And all these things are interconnected. And that's why it's so important to understand all the different aspects of Bitcoin. I mean, if Bitcoin wasn't decentralized and scarce, then it wouldn't be very valuable, and therefore it would be a very good privacy tool. The fact that it's actually decentralized and actually scarce is so important. Otherwise, we don't have a reasonable digital privacy tool, right? So I'm going to run through a couple questions to conclude here, or topics that were suggested to me from the Fidelity folks, just to conclude about why financial privacy is so important for human rights. There's often this idea of like, I have nothing to hide, which we saw brought up time and time again in the last 20 years over just general communications privacy. Like, why would you want encrypted messaging? Like, what are you hiding, right? And I think it's just a very clever version of propaganda, basically, because from what I'm seeing, working with human rights activists around the world, they absolutely need privacy for personal safety, right? If they don't have privacy in their transactions, their choices, their daily habits, like they will get stopped or controlled, or in some way their effectiveness will be reduced as free individuals, and that is not ideal. And you can start thinking about this quite clearly in terms of a future where there is no paper money, and you want to do something that's slightly in the gray zone, or something that you may think maybe your employer or the government may not like, and you literally won't be able to do it. You'll be so afraid, right? So that's already what's happened in places like China. So to preserve individual freedom and safety, I would say we absolutely need financial privacy. There's this idea of mass surveillance and its effectiveness, right? So we've seen in the post 9/11 world just how ineffective mass surveillance is. There's been studies that have come out in the last couple of years showing how hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on mass surveillance programs catching 0, 1, or 2 people, something like that. If you actually look at the history of 9/11, it wasn't that we didn't have a big enough Orwellian police state to catch everybody. That's not why 9/11 happened. 9/11 happened because we didn't do enough old school investigative police work, and because the different government agencies were not cooperating and not talking to each other. It was not because there weren't enough surveillance cameras in the United States. And anyone who tells you that is full of it or lying. In fact, if you have this kind of all-seeing surveillance state, it makes it much more likely that citizens will become victims of human rights violations. So there's this kind of morality piece of mass surveillance, but there's also like the effectiveness piece of mass surveillance. There's a really interesting topic that was suggested I talk about called basically the 2 Bitcoin problem, which essentially talks about a potential future where, let's say in the United States, these big companies like Coinbase and Square are forced by the government to eliminate private withdrawals, thereby kind of creating 2 different Bitcoins. One, a very KYC'd kind of whitelist Bitcoin, right? This is the idea. And you can buy Bitcoin, but it has to live with these like companies, right? And then there's like the black market Bitcoin, right? Which is, not KYC'd and purchased through other means. And I don't think that'll happen in the United States. I actually spoke to some folks recently in one of the government agencies who said that was probably unlikely at this point, but you never know. You never know. I think we want to be safe, but that is the 2 Bitcoin problem, and it's probably one of the biggest risks to Bitcoin. I don't think it would kill Bitcoin. there's just way too much desire globally for relatively private, permissionless, scarce asset. And there's so much investment interest in the United States even that it seems unlikely that it would happen. But it's something that we should all keep our eye on. And this is relevant for what the commissioner said about why he was not so sure about privacy coins, and they weren't really being adopted. That's why Bitcoin privacy is so critical. The investment and scarcity and value piece of Bitcoin is the platform through which we can achieve privacy in the future. If Bitcoin becomes increasingly valuable because of its model, the way Satoshi built it with its decentralized digital scarcity, if it continues to become more valuable, if more people learn about it and want to invest in it as a store of value, then it leaves not a whole lot of room for governments to like ban it, because those governments are going to want some themselves, right? So if you all of a sudden in the future have this scenario where some governments are trying to ban it, but other governments are trying to acquire it to store like in their reserves, that's not super tenable. So there's a really interesting game theory going on where Bitcoin seems potentially destined to become this like very valuable asset. And if we can just bake in the Bitcoin privacy in the next couple of years, we will have this extremely powerful civil liberties tool, which I'm quite excited about. So we want to keep our eye on the 2 Bitcoin problem. I think that's the biggest risk right now to financial privacy, especially in a place like the United States. So the good work that folks are doing behind the scenes to convince government officials that it would be un-American to do this, I think is great. We should support them. But ultimately, we need to support the open source developers. This is why the Human Rights Foundation has started a Bitcoin development fund, because at the end of the day, it's about the open source software. It can't be stopped. And it is a gift that we've been given that we can transact globally, permissionlessly, without asking anybody, in minutes. And, humans before, a few years ago never had that opportunity. Refugees never had that opportunity. People fleeing from dictatorship never had that opportunity. There continues to be countries whose currencies collapse overnight, like just happened in Sudan, a country of 40 million people just a few days ago. Hyperinflation is a global phenomenon, not an isolated one. And people now have a tool. If they can learn about it and use it, and all of this local liquidity is exploding in all these countries, ranging from Nigeria to Iran to China. It's happening. So it's an option for folks. And, the more private we can make it, the more civil liberties we'll have in the future. And I'll just end with this quote from Wei Dai, one of the cypherpunks whose work, went into Bitcoin. He said, "There has never been a government that didn't sooner or later try to reduce the freedom of its subjects and gain more control over them. And there will probably never be one. Therefore, instead of trying to convince our current government not to try, we'll develop the technology that will make it impossible for the government to succeed." That's what we have to do. And a key part of that is in defeating the chain analysis companies. So you're about to hear from someone who would take a very opposing view to me, but I believe that chain analysis is immoral, ineffective, and is essentially like, at the end of the day, very anti-human rights. So you'll get to hear his case. But I would like for us to take a stand for open source software, for privacy in the future. And to do that, we need to defeat chain surveillance. So thanks everybody so much. I really appreciate you listening to me. You can follow me at Gladstein on Twitter. And thanks for the folks at Fidelity for having me. Take care.